Thank you so much, Marta, for joining us. And thank you also so much for sponsoring this event. And it's been really lovely to collaborate with you on like so many other events. I feel like almost now you're like almost every single Foresight event that we can have you at. I think the last one, Foresight one, was also at the Internet Archive Vision Weekend, and it was upstairs, which was really fun. And then I just interviewed you also at DWeb Camp, which is hosted by the Internet Archive at Camp Navarro, like I guess 2 weeks ago now. So I think it's an interesting time to also put together some of your work on like civil liberties, privacy, also with some of the perspectives on AI and like the upcoming challenges. And so, yeah, I would just, perhaps you can introduce yourself in a few words and like, what you're currently working on and like why you in particular think that like civil liberties and like privacy are like, essential bits and what may happen to them in the future.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for putting me after a break. That's always nice to have everyone's glucose levels up and rested. So glad to be here. Thanks so much. So I'm Marta Belcher. I'm the president and chair of the Filecoin Foundation. I'm also the general counsel and head of policy at Protocol Labs. And I am a civil liberties attorney turned cryptocurrency attorney. I care a lot about the intersection of civil liberties and new technologies, and making sure that as we progress, that these technologies serve to enhance our civil liberties rather than to detract from them. That was what drew me to cryptocurrency in the first place. And I definitely think that we're at a really interesting point in both civil liberties and technology, where we really see the ways in which cryptocurrency can enhance civil liberties being sort of under attack. And so a really interesting inflection point at this moment in time where we have the ability to really think about what our civil liberties mean in the context of this technology.
And what do you think, like, let's just bracket AI out just for a second, like what do you currently see as like some of the emerging challenges and also like tools and opportunities like built in the crypto sector?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting, one of the things that are so important about cryptocurrency for civil liberties is that they really import the benefits of cash into the online world. So the privacy, the ability to have private transactions, the resistance to censorship, right? These are really important things that cryptocurrency brings online. And one of the things we've also seen at the same time is over the years, there has been a huge amount of financial surveillance and also financial censorship. And what we've seen in the last few years is regulators around the world really taking that financial censorship and financial surveillance and trying to push it on to cryptocurrency. So we see things like Tornado Cash, or we see different laws that are being proposed to really make it impossible to transact privately. And I think that that's a really interesting moment for us, because we can start to think about, okay, does it make sense to take these laws, this mass surveillance, and impose it onto cryptocurrency, but does this mass surveillance of financial transactions make sense at all, right? And we can actually use cryptocurrency and this inflection point and this moment where we have a battle over this technology to actually push back on the financial censorship that we've and financial surveillance that we've seen in the traditional banking system for decades. So I think it's a really interesting and important moment in time. And I think we, as people who care about these technologies, are in a really unique position to actually challenge the censorship and surveillance that's been happening for decades.
And with like Filecoin and like perhaps Protocol Labs as well, given that you have like these two heads, like what in particular like are you most focused on right now? Like what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, so there's so much going on. So an interesting thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about Protocol Labs is that the mission is far bigger than cryptocurrency, far bigger than decentralized storage. The mission is actually to push humanity forward through advances in computing. So that is a really large mission, and that's why one of the many different areas that we think about is AI, right? But I think in general, this is a landscape where this technology, I think both Protocol Labs and Filecoin Foundation, the sort of fundamental thinking around this is these are such important technologies for both advancing humanity and also advancing important human rights angles, and these are really important technologies for human rights. So some of the things we do at Filecoin Foundation, for example, are use decentralized storage, decentralized technologies to really push forward both civil liberties and human rights. So for example, we have partnerships with the Freedom of the Press Foundation to think about the ways that whistleblowers can use these technologies. We have partnerships with human rights data analysis organizations, that kind of thing, to really make sure that we are both preserving important information, preserving evidence, and using these technologies in ways that further human rights.
Yeah, I think definitely kind of can second that. I think just given Juan Benet, like his talks mostly, like I think in one of the previous ones he took Eric Drexler's Proletopia framework and literally like applied it to crypto and like, you know, was thinking about like how can cryptographic tools really like solve more of the kind of like longer standing coordination challenges. So I think you do have a pretty broad mission, which I think is like, yeah, quite inspirational. And, you know, if you think about like AI in particular, you know, like how do you think that one will impact many of the bits that you're currently working on? Like, if you think about like civil liberties or like privacy in specific context, like where do you see like upcoming challenges? Where do you see opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a couple of really interesting things going on with AI. So one really important thing is the question of when does the government get to use any technology, like any particular technology, not just AI, and under what circumstances, right? Because that's a really important piece of ensuring that we have civil liberties. So, you know, one example where you've seen this is, you know, facial recognition technology, and I think we need to have a really important conversation about when and under what circumstances can government be using AI technologies. Just to give you a couple of examples, you know, the government has for many years used different algorithms in determining whether someone is likely to reoffend if they're, you know, in criminal sentencing or in making bail decisions, right? Also in deciding, you know, there have been examples of police departments using algorithms for predictive policing, like what is the heat map of areas that we should go send our police forces into, which obviously is sort of self-perpetuating because then you have a lot of police there. And also things like you know, child services, trying to figure out how likely it is that like children are abused. So there are all these ways where algorithms, often that are developed by private companies and often are black boxes, have actually in the past been and continue to be used in things that really have a huge effect on people, on the way that the government takes away people's freedoms. And I think that, you know, when you fast forward into AI and all of that, those capabilities, I think it's really scary to think about the government using technologies in those ways. So I think that's one really important thing. The other really important thing is one thing that I care a lot about is mass surveillance. And you know, one of the things that we know is that the government has for many, many years, we know thanks to Ed Snowden and many others, the government has for many, many years in the United States, you know, to say nothing of other countries around the world, right? Just thinking about the United States for a moment. The government has been collecting massive amounts of data that it's been storing in huge data warehouses, right? And why, you know, is that, why would we be at least a little bit comfortable with that? Well, you know, at least there isn't going to be a human who can actually look through all that data, right? Like that data in the past was sitting there and there was really not that much you could do with it. And now when you apply the fact that all of that data has been collected for decades and decades and decades, and suddenly we have the ability to really parse it very quickly and to have an AI actually lay eyes on it and do things with that data, I think it's very scary. So I think one thing we really need to care about in the context of AI is whether and under what circumstances governments should be allowed to use that technology.
And you know, how could one possibly like make progress on this? Like, do you think there's more tools in the legal domain that are interesting here, or like, you know, even in like cryptographic progress? Like, yeah, how could one like actually like make a stab at this?
Well, one question is, you know, for people who are in the room here who are working on these technologies, you know, one thing is that the government has to actually get those tools often, right? They're not, let me say, they're not building their own AIs necessarily, right? So they have to actually get these technologies from private companies. So one question is, are you, as people who have private companies, who are you going to do business with? And what are you going to do? Who are you going to allow to use your tools and for what, right? So that matters a lot, actually. The second is absolutely there's a possibility and the ability for people to push forward on laws that limit the ability of governments to use these types of technologies for those things. I mean, there's already been cases that challenged, for example, the use of algorithms, plain old algorithms, in sentencing. Unfortunately, actually, one of those cases that was sort of one of the early cases, the Loomis case, actually went the wrong way. And the answer was, yep, totally fine, that someone got a long sentence because of a black box algorithm that said they were high risk to reoffend. That's totally fine because we were transparent enough about what the output of the algorithm is, even though no one has any idea what was in the algorithm. That was the outcome of that case. And so I do think also important battles to be had in the courts.
Damn, yeah, I remember Peter Eckersley also, whom I think many people here really loved and cherish. He did one of a long time ago now Foresight presentation on the more predictive incarceration, and it was really scary. And so yeah, it's definitely still happening. And so do you think of any ways in which AI could not make it perhaps easier to infringe on civil liberties, but could perhaps also help elevate our sense of civil liberties? Or do you see any positives there that people could be working on?
Absolutely. And to be clear, I am not anti-AI, and my views on these technologies are really not that okay, it can be used for bad things, therefore we shouldn't move it forward. It's just really about putting restrictions on the government on what they can do. And I do think that fundamentally, when it comes to AI, so one of the things that I actually worry about sort of more broadly with AI is this idea of regulating AI. And here's what I am worried about there. I think there are a lot of compelling reasons, and I'm sure a lot of the conversations that folks are having here today there are compelling reasons for AI regulation, right? But one thing that I have thought a lot about in the sort of cryptocurrency context is the importance of this idea that code is speech, right? And that code should be protected, again, in the United States context, by the First Amendment. And so for me, I think we really need to hold the line on writing computer code is protected activity. And I worry a lot about the types of regulation that, if you were to sit here and you're okay, you work for a senator who wants to propose AI regulations or an AI legislation, right? And you actually have to write out what does that look like? How do you actually do that in a way that doesn't undermine this idea that of code is speech? That's not to say that you shouldn't. That's not to say there shouldn't be any regulations. It's just to say I think we all should have a really big red flag when we think about what those types of regulations are actually going to look like, especially in places in the world where you don't have First Amendment protections. And so you can't actually push back on that by arguing, well, code is First Amendment protections, because there are no First Amendment protections, right? And I think that has a lot of implications beyond AI.
You also mentioned that, at least also, I think also at DWeb, that you also, really focus on copyright implications, in particular around AI and so forth. Maybe you could fill more people in on what especially you focus on there.
Yeah, so I think another, frankly, I think that in the short term, the super short term, what are the threats to AI being able to realize its potential, right, in the short term in the United States and elsewhere. And I think one of the big battles there is really copyright battles, and those are the battles that we're seeing as the first court battles surrounding AI. And so when you think about copyright, I'm a former intellectual property litigator, and when you think about copyright and AI, I think the way to think about it is really that there are these three buckets. The first bucket is the inputs to AI. So what things get fed into AI as training models, right? And what about when those things are copyrighted material, as so much of material is, right? And then the second issue is the outputs. So what happens when AI actually outputs something that looks a lot like something that is copyrighted, right? Is that copyright infringement, and under what circumstances is that copyright infringement? And then the last one is sort of authorship, and ownership, who is the author, who gets to copyright something that is AI generated? So these are three really interesting questions, but they're separate questions, and it's important to keep them separate when you talk about them, because I think they have different implications. One area that I think is really important is this idea of inputs. So, and right now we're already seeing court battles over the issue of inputs. I think there are a lot of artists, for example, who are very concerned about and you know, I think upset about the idea that AI is learning from their works, right? And you have a lot of creators who are really concerned about this. I think those are obviously valid concerns, but here's the thing about those concerns. The thing about those concerns is, from a legal perspective, when you are, you know, when you're creating, when you're looking for inputs to put into AI, right? The legal standards that you're looking at are really based on this concept of being able to go scrape the web, right? This is exactly the same thing that Google uses in order to make Google exist. If Google couldn't go look at all this copyrighted material, learn from it, present it in some different way, then we just would not have Google, right? And that's a really important legal precedent. Also important for things like, you know, having news, right? And of course, I say Google, but I also mean the decentralized alternatives that I'm sure all of us are working on building here. And so I do worry a lot in the inputs debate, because I think it's really important that we both address the concerns that creators have that are valid about their works being used, but also at the same time, I think it's really important that we protect very hard-fought and very important precedents about making sure that people can go, that AI, that machines can go and learn from all of the material that is out there in the world and do something with it. I think that's really important for the future of knowledge and information.
Is there anything in particular that you want people here to work on?
Oh my gosh, so many things. There's so many things. Like I think there's some really interesting things that folks are working on. So many things. I think there's some really interesting things people are working on in the context of, like, how do you address those concerns from artists and creators without undermining this type of legal precedent, right? Because I think just saying too bad is, you know, like not going to be super helpful, at least from like a comms perspective and like from actually addressing people's concerns perspective. So I think that's really interesting stuff. You know, I think in general, like, this is not a particularly novel thought, but like, you know, I think one of the things that's really interesting about AI is you have these bot problems on Twitter, which we all talk about all the time. And like, gosh, you know, fast forward 1 year, 2 years, like, it is going to be so hard to be on social media and be on the internet and distinguish between what is and isn't actually what is and isn't actually AI and what is actually human. And so I do think one of the things that's really interesting in the sort of like crypto arena meets AI arena is this idea of being able to actually like prove humanness and prove what types of activities on the internet are human or not, because otherwise I think fast forwarding not into the not too distant future, it's going to be really hard to understand what on the internet is from humans and what isn't.
Great, so we already have a few ideas for a challenge that you could give people. Is there a question or two? Yeah.
I wanted to go back to So if I go back to the stuff you were saying at the very beginning about cryptocurrency as an agent of helping with civil liberties, there's this dream of cryptocurrencies as an actually distributed system, just like there's this dream of the internet as an actually distributed system, but the reality of the internet is that it is highly dependent on a few centralized systems that if they go down, I mean, a major CDN goes down and our experience of the internet is toast. The same thing is true of basically all the cryptocurrencies that in theory they are decentralized, but in practice the pressure is towards centralization and everybody just interacts with Coinbase and it doesn't matter what what's happening underneath. Do you see a way of reconciling that conflict, or are we just going to be stuck with theoretically decentralized, but actually in practice completely centralized systems?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think this idea of like the general like trends towards centralization is one that is very well taken, and I think all of the sort of Web3 efforts to re-decentralize the internet, like really, I think are doing a good job of reminding people that like the original internet vision was decentralized, because frankly, I think most people have just straight up forgotten that. My hope is that in the cryptocurrency context, at least we hit decentralization enough and actually push towards decentralization enough and resist those re-centralization forces enough that we don't forget that the vision here is decentralization. Because I think you're right. I think decentralization requires, in many ways, acting in ways that feel unnatural or resisting forces that push things towards centralization. And I do think it's a difficult thing to promote. I don't have a silver bullet, though I wish I did. But I do think that, I hope that in 10 years, 20 years, we won't have to have an effort to re-decentralize Web3, like we have our current effort to re-decentralize the internet. I hope that we have solved that problem and pushed towards decentralization.
Well, DWeb is always a great reminder of that.
Yes, exactly.
So do you want to give us a challenge for people to work on? Like, what would you like people to solve?
Gosh, so hard. So I think challenges that people can solve. How do you prevent this? I mean, this is frankly a really difficult. This is like just a really difficult problem. Like the really difficult problem is like, how do you prevent technologies that you build that can do really awesome things from being used by governments around the world to oppress people, right? And by being used to against civil liberties rather than for civil liberties. And I think that's a really difficult challenge. I think it's one that anyone building any technology should be thinking about.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marta.
All right, thank you.